Today's text from Proverbs is an acrostic poem about a virtuous, strong, worthy wife. You might remember acrostic poems from around the 4th grade. It's where each line begins with a specific letter, like Alison might be, adventurous, listless, although I wasn't listless, imaginative. In this case, the first line starts with Aleph, or the Hebrew letter A, and each consecutive line starts with the next letter of the alphabet. It's literally the ABCs or Aleph Beit of how to be a good woman or good wife. By the way, a shot means woman, and it also means wife, so you can read this opening either way. A capable woman, who can find? A capable wife, who can find? When you start reading through the list of qualities she possesses, it's easy to see why it's hard to find her. Her skill set is vast. I'd be thrilled if I could get done in 3 months what she gets done every day. The Proverbs 31 wife gets up before dawn, works out, feeds her husband and her live-in help, sews clothing for herself and her family. In addition to being a domestic goddess, it sounds like she's a profitable workaholic outside the home, and as a farmer, she is competent in purchasing land, planting crop, and marketing the harvest. After she's done farming each day, she goes home, sews some extra linen outfits, and sells them. She is always kind. Her live-in nanny and housekeepers and farm help and pool boy all love her. And her children and this husband would describe her as happy. She never yells at her kids. So she is not mean. She is like a magical combination of Martha Stewart, Abigail Adams, Dolly Parton, and Eileen Fisher, all wrapped into one, who always leaves her husband smiling and her children joyful. If you've ever seen Marvelous Mrs. Maisel, she's Mrs. Maisel, putting on makeup and turning on the pot roast before her husband wakes. While we can all probably think of someone who has some of these characteristics in its whole, this text sets up an impossible standard for living. It is a man-made checklist. That's right, made by men, for the perfect woman or the perfect wife. But the checklist is too long and too perfect to be real. This text reminds me of being a teenager and a young woman and feeling like I had to do it all. Like I had to be perfect, or at least pretty good at everything if I ever wanted to get married and have a family. The world told me I had to be a good-looking, a good athlete, a good student, a good cook, and a good date to have any chance of landing a good husband. I literally spent one summer in high school learning to make pies, bread, and quilts because I was worried that I wouldn't be domestic enough to secure a boyfriend. Looking back, that seems absolutely ridiculous. As it turns out, my husband likes cobbler and not pies, and I can have a seamstress sew the ring on his uniform. This text also reminds me of being a new wife and then a new mom and feeling like I needed to be perfect for my husband and baby. I watched a documentary once about home births, and I became convinced that I needed to have a baby at home if I wanted my baby to properly bond with me. I literally thought that I needed to have the baby at home if I wanted to prove that I was a strong and capable woman, and to prove I could be a good mom. I worried, like so many of us have, over which car seat and crib and stroller to get. I worried about how much and for how long to breastfeed. I worried about baby food and diapers and swim lessons. I spent hours and hours comparing myself to other moms, worried I wasn't doing it right and they were doing it better. Looking back on those first few years, that too now seems ridiculous. Faye is just fine, and so are the kids who had a different car seat or bottles for baby food. Mom guilt and wife guilt are both big industries. There are countless self-help books, podcasts, devotionals, and Facebook groups dedicated to telling women how to be the best woman, wife, mother, and girl boss they can be. There are entire websites and devotional series and sections of Christian bookstores dedicated to helping women become more like the Psalm 31 wife. And while these may be helpful for some, for others, they can lead to self-doubt and insecurity. They can lead to worrying that you're not doing enough or not doing it right. So while I'm super happy for the man who found this unicorn of a capable wife, I think we should also be very careful about the messages we send our girlfriends and our daughters. Sure, be a capable wife, be a capable mother, be a capable farmer, be a capable girl boss. But know that sometimes you can't do it all at once. And know that even when those things fail, you are still capable. It wasn't you who failed. It was the crop. It was the marriage. It was the market. You are still you, and you are still valuable, even if it feels like the rest is going to hell. And for the men, this holds as well. Just because your life doesn't look the way the world told you it should does not mean there's something wrong with you. Don't waste too much money comparing yourself to others. Because, as they say, comparison is the thief of joy. The second problem with this text is that it sets the woman in the context of a marriage and family life, assuming that the role of wife or mother is what makes this woman wonderful. Let's be clear, this woman was wonderful before she met her husband. She was wonderful before she had children. She would have been wonderful and competent even if she hadn't had a husband or children. Honestly, she probably would have made a lot more money. Who knows if she even liked her husband and kids? This story, which was written by men and for men, leaves out the stories of pain and struggle faced by people who don't want to get married or who never found their person. It leaves out the stories of people who struggle with infertility. It leaves out the stories of people who struggle to make ends meet. After all, this woman was very, very wealthy. And it leaves out the stories of people who did everything right, but still found themselves with spouses who abandoned them or their children. So congratulations to the capable woman, but it was harder for Sarah, who struggled with infertility. It was harder for Hagar, who was forced to have Abraham's baby and then was abandoned by her baby daddy and had to figure out how to make it as a single mother. It was harder for Rahab the harlot, who had to use her body and skills to put a roof over her head. It was harder for Esther and Ruth, who had to use their female wiles to save themselves and secure a future for the entire Jewish people. These women were not any less capable or competent than the woman in Psalm 31. Their lives were just different. Probably harder. At every turn, they did what they had to take care of themselves and their families. They did what they had to do to survive. We should remember them as we consider what it means to be a capable woman or man today. Even if wife or mother or farmer or seamstress or business owner don't happen for you or aren't right for you or didn't happen for you, remember you are still very competent. You are still strong, vigorous, and worthy. Don't compare your chapter 1 to someone else's chapter 10. Because, as they say, comparison is the thief of joy. The third problem with this text is that the male writer claims the husband is always happy. Anyone who's ever been in a marriage or relationship knows that there is no way to make sure your spouse is always happy. You can do what you can do, and it's up to them to be happy or not. You can only control what you can control. If they wake up grumpy, they wake up grumpy. There's very little you can do about that. And anyone who's ever been in a relationship also knows that there's a lot to a relationship that the world does not see. I wonder, did the writer of this ode know this wife? Was he married to her? Or was he assuming that things were great based on what he was seeing from the outside? Even the best relationships have problems. So don't look at Facebook or Instagram or your neighbors at the club and assume that just because it looks perfect, it is. The grass may be greener, but it almost never actually is. It's probably just a different variety. Don't compare your Bermuda lawn to someone else's fescue. Comparison is the thief of joy, and there's a lot that does not meet the eye. My point in deconstructing this text isn't to say that it's bad necessarily, but it has certainly been used as a weapon against women throughout history. So when we consider what makes a strong, virtuous, vigorous, worthy woman, I want us to think of the Psalm 31 woman, but also all the others. I want us to think about the ways our stories leave others out, and to consider as we read or promote any text, in the Bible or otherwise, who wrote it? Who does this help? Who might it hurt? The story of Christian history is full of a Schatzheil, virtuous women. And I'd love to make an acrostic book celebrating each of them. But in closing today, I want to tell you about one of my favorites. Maybe she is yours too, or she's about to be. This is the story of Katharina von Bora, who married Martin Luther. In my opinion, she is the real hero of the Reformation. And while she has a lot in common with the woman from Psalm 31, Katharina could be a real pain in the tuchus. Tuchus, by the way, is the Yiddish word for behind. Katharina von Bora was sent to a Benedictine monastery when she was 5 years old. And in those days, it was common for wealthy families who could spare a child who didn't need them for farming or other labor to send a child to a monastery or cloister for religious education. And it was thought that this was sort of like buying an indulgence. By giving up a child to the church, you would help ensure that your family would have a better shot of getting into heaven. So Katharina goes off to school, and she grows up, and she becomes a nun. And at some point, she gets interested in the Reformation, along with a bunch of her other nun friends, and they decide they want out. So she reaches out to Martin Luther for help escaping to the monastery. So Martin Luther and his buddies arrange for these women to sneak out of the cloister. Luther sends this guy named Kopp, who is a fishmonger and regularly delivers herring to the monastery. And he's supposed to take his covered wagon and his barrels of fish and sneak these women out. So Kopp goes, and the women get in the back of the wagon, and they hide in fish barrels, right? And Kopp drives the wagon to Wittenberg, which is where Luther lives. So now Luther's got all these women in Wittenberg, and he has to figure out what to do with them. So at first he'd asked family members and relatives if they would take care of the women, because really they have no marketable skills. They've been nuns forever, and that probably won't get them very far in taking care of themselves. So he asked family members, hey, will you take so-and-so? But none of the family members will do it, because they're like, no, man, no. That is illegal to be hiding runaway nuns. I don't want to die. I'm not doing that. So then he's in a situation where he has to figure out what to do with them, so he determines he has to marry them off. So he and his buddies figure out a bunch of suitors, they marry all these women off. But there's one left, one who doesn't like any of her proposed suitors, and that is Katharina von Bora. To be clear, Katharina had some really good potential suitors. Like, these were top-notch, like, most of us would have said yes. But Katharina finally says, I don't want to get married unless it's to Luther himself. Now, Luther had no interest in getting married, and his buddies think that's a terrible idea. They're like, no, man, you do not want to be getting married. Like, look, you've already caused a lot of problems in Europe. The last thing you need is some, wife drama. So he hems and haws, and goes back and forth, and they make pro-con charts, like, should I marry her, should I not? And finally he decides, reluctantly, he's going to marry Katharina von Bora. And it turns out to be the best thing ever, which is often the case if you can find a really virtuous woman. So as a wedding gift, John the Elixir of Saxony, who's a big deal in the region, he gifts them the monastery, the Augustinian monastery, where Luther had been teaching and studying as a monk. Imagine that as a gift, an entire monastery. It's like the size of this church. It's huge, it's absolutely massive. So that's great. Katharina and Martin now have somewhere to live, but they don't really have any money. They are house rich and cash poor. So while Martin sits around writing his religious tracts and living it up as a biblical scholar who set Europe on fire, his wife has to get to work making money to support them. Of course she did. It turns out that despite her early life as a nun, Katharina is a pretty savvy businesswoman. Katharina's kind of Psalm 31 gal. She starts breeding and selling cattle. She starts brewing beer and turns a portion of the huge monastery into an ale hall and restaurant. She turns another part into a hostel to host the never-ending stream of students that have come to learn from her husband Martin, and she does it all well and kind of makes a profit. When illness would spread in the town, she turned part of the monastery into a hospital and would invite nurses in to come help care for the sick. Katerina is awesome. Luther nicknamed her the boss of Zulsdorf and called her the, quote, morning star of Wittenberg, because she would get up every morning at 4 o'clock to run her life. In many of his writings, he referred to her as my boss, Katie. In one of his table talks, he said, quote, you convince me of whatever you please. You have complete control. I concede to you the control of the household, providing my rights are preserved. Female government has never done any good. Luther was obsessed with Paul, the biblical writer. He had his entire theological breakthrough and started the Reformation mostly because of his readings of Paul. But Martin obviously had a different take than Paul on the role a woman should play in the home. Martin was also obsessed with Katie. You have complete control, my boss, Katie. Katie Luther bore 6 children of her own, suffered 1 miscarriage, and raised 4 additional children who'd been orphaned. And while she wasn't always easy to live with, there is no doubt that Martin Luther loved her. As he once wrote, quote, if I can endure conflict with the devil, sin, and a bad conscience, then I can put up with the irritations of Katie on Laura. When he died, Luther named Katie his sole heir. His will could not be executed because it was not legal at that time to leave your property to a woman. Before he had died, he'd encouraged Katie to sell the cloister, but she had refused. The war eventually forced her to flee Wittenberg shortly after Martin's death. But when she returned to Wittenberg in 1547, the cattle had been stolen and the property destroyed. She lived out the rest of her days in relative poverty. She died at the age of 53 after being thrown from a cart into a ditch. On her deathbed, she said, I will stick to Christ as a bird to cloth. Katie Luther lived and died a Christian. And because she was a pain in the tuchus, she showed generations of Protestant women after her that a woman could work, that a woman could be the boss of her own household and holdings. And we can thank the boss of Zulsdorf for forcing the issue of clergy marriage. It is because of her that Protestant pastors can be married today. I doubt she ever compared herself to others. I bet Katie Luther knew that comparison was a thief of joy. So if Proverbs 31 annoys you, think instead of Katie Luther. She's the kind of Proverbs 31 woman that we need. A pain in the tuchus, a woman with her own mind, snuck out of a convent in a fish barrel. Katie was a valorous woman indeed. Amen.